The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and cold winter air drifting through the revolving doors. Sophia Bennett sat in the witness stand, gripping the edge of the microphone so tightly that her knuckles turned pale. She cleared her throat, her voice calm but edged with pain. "Your Honor, I'm here today because the man standing over there, Eric Johnson, is trying to blackmail me." A rustle moved through the crowded courtroom. People leaned forward. The judge lifted an eyebrow, adjusting his glasses. Sophia swallowed, blinking rapidly. 12 years ago, Eric and I were married. We were expecting twins, or at least that's what we thought. But during delivery, I gave birth to triplets. It was early. The babies were fragile. I was terrified. She paused, eyes unfocused, seeing a memory no one else could see. And Eric, well, he wasn't ready for any of it. The stress, the fear, the hospital bills, it all piled up. One day he said he was stepping out for some air, and he never came back. Eric shifted uncomfortably beside his attorney, avoiding Sophia's eyes. Sophia continued, her tone even. "I wish I could say that was the end of it, that I moved on, raised my kids, and never thought of him again. But it's never that simple, is it?" She took a slow breath. 2 weeks ago, Eric showed up at my office. After 12 years of silence, he said he was broke, lost his job, drowning in debt. And then he told me he'd tell the kids that Thomas, my husband now, and he once made a bet about me. A stupid, cruel bet back when we first met. Gasps slipped out from the audience. Sophia closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. I never knew. Not back then. And now Eric is trying to use that secret to rip apart my marriage, my reputation, my children's peace of mind. Eric opened his mouth as though to protest, but his lawyer laid a hand on his arm. Sophia looked up, her voice softening. "I'm not here because I hate him. I'm here because I'm done being afraid. I'm here because my kids deserve to know the truth. But on my terms, not as part of a threat for cash." She blinked back, tears, voice growing firm. "I spent 12 years rebuilding my life. I worked my way up in my career. I raised my children. I fell in love again. And I will not let Eric Johnson tear it all down because he can't face the consequences of the choices he made." She glanced at Eric, her eyes glinting. "I'm not the woman he left behind, and I refuse to let my children become collateral damage in his mess." Sophia drew a shaky breath, pressing her palms flat on the witness stand. The judge leaned forward, voice measured. "Ms. Bennett, thank you. We will proceed accordingly." As the bailiff called the next motions, a hush lingered over the courtroom. The silence of people witnessing a woman who, after years of heartbreak, refused to bow to fear ever again. And Eric Johnson lowered his eyes, knowing he might have just lost the only chance he'd ever have to put his shattered life back together. 12 years earlier, Chicago buzzed beneath bright city lights, neon signs glowing in the mist rising from the streets after an early spring rain. Inside the Skyline Lounge, a rooftop bar perched above Michigan Avenue. Laughter rippled through the crowd as music thumped softly under strings of Edison bulbs. The place smelled of whiskey-grilled steaks and that faint ozone scent drifting in through open balcony doors. Sophia Bennett stood at the bar, swirling the last of her cranberry vodka in a tall glass. She wore a simple navy dress that hugged her frame in a way that made her feel both confident and a little exposed. Her friend Jasmine nudged her with an elbow. "Girl, you need to relax. You look like you're cross-examining the bartender." Sophia cracked a smile. "I'm just taking it all in. New job, new city. Feels like a lot, you know." Jasmine grinned. "Yeah, well, if you're gonna start fresh anywhere, it may as well be Chicago. This city doesn't let you hide." Sophia chuckled, glancing around. A burst of laughter rose from a group near the balcony. That's where she first saw Eric Johnson. He stood a little apart from the others, one hand resting on the balcony railing, the other holding a bottle of beer. His dark hair was cropped short, a little messy, like he'd run his fingers through it one too many times. A leather jacket hung over broad shoulders, his posture casual but somehow watchful. Their eyes met for just a moment. Eric's lips quirked into a grin, the kind that suggested he saw something amusing about the world, or about her. Sophia glanced away quickly, heat rising to her cheeks. Jasmine leaned closer, whispering, "Oh, he's cute, and he's staring at you. Don't look now." Sophia rolled her eyes. "Please, the last thing I need is to get tangled up with some random bar guy." But Jasmine was already waving him over. Eric approached with a confidence that felt natural, not forced. He stopped a few feet away, giving Sophia space, his grin softening into something more genuine. "Hi, sorry to interrupt, I'm Eric." Sophia hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Sophia." Eric glanced around, shrugging one shoulder. "Not gonna lie, I was over there pretending to be part of a conversation I wasn't listening to. You just seemed like someone I'd regret not meeting." Sophia blinked, caught off guard by the honesty. "That's unexpectedly polite." Eric chuckled. "Don't get used to it. I can be an asshole too. But for now, I'm going with polite." Jasmine clapped her hands. "I'm getting a refill. You two chat." She disappeared into the crowd, leaving Sophia and Eric standing there, music humming around them like a living thing. Eric leaned closer, lowering his voice. "So, new to the city?" Sophia sipped her drink. "Yeah, I just moved here a few months ago. Started working as an associate at Klein & Marks." Eric whistled low. "Lawyer, damn, I'd better watch my step." Sophia smirked. "Only if you're planning on committing tax fraud or insider trading." Eric held up both hands. "Noted. No illegal investments. Just real estate sales. Mostly condos and commercial spaces. Boring stuff." Sophia tilted her head. "Nothing boring about helping people find a place to live. Chicago's a tough city." Eric's grin faded a little, replaced by something more thoughtful. "Yeah, it is. But sometimes it's exactly the place you end up finding yourself." Sophia studied him, realizing he wasn't all jokes and smooth lines. There was a tiredness in his eyes, like someone who'd already lived too many lifetimes for his age. Nearby, another man watched them from across the bar. Thomas Cooper. He was quiet, dressed in a charcoal gray shirt and jeans, his sandy blonde hair, neatly cut wire-frame glasses catching the light. He held a glass of scotch, his eyes focused on Eric and Sophia, unreadable. Thomas and Eric had known each other since high school, roommates in college, partners in too many half-baked business ideas. And tonight, unwilling conspirators in a bet that should never have existed. Earlier that evening, Eric had leaned over to Thomas at the bar, speaking low so no one else could hear. 2000 says I can get that lawyer to go out with me before the week's over." Thomas had frowned. "Man, what the hell is wrong with you? She's not some game." Eric had rolled his eyes. "It's not serious, just a laugh." But Thomas knew Eric, knew how he turned charm into a weapon. And as he watched Sophia laugh softly at something Eric said, guilt twisted his gut. Because part of him, a part he hated, wondered if he wished he'd been the one brave enough to walk over and say hello first. Back on the balcony, Sophia leaned her elbows on the rail, Chicago's lights glittering below. Eric stepped beside her. "I know this might sound crazy, but do you ever feel like some moments change your whole life?" Sophia turned to him, a soft smile playing at her lips. "Yeah, sometimes I do." And under the pulse of the city, two people who barely knew each other shared a quiet moment neither of them realized would ripple through the rest of their lives. In the weeks after that night on the rooftop, Sophia found herself thinking about Eric more often than she wanted to admit. He kept things casual at first, texting funny memes during work hours, calling her late at night just to ask how her day had gone. One Friday, he showed up outside her office unannounced, leaning against his silver Honda with a coffee carrier in his hand. "You mentioned you skipped lunch yesterday. I figured I'd make sure that didn't happen again." Sophia blinked at him, caught between suspicion and a warm flutter in her chest. "That's actually very considerate," Eric grinned. "Don't get used to it. I'm usually a selfish jerk." But he wasn't, not entirely. Eric took her to try new restaurants tucked into hidden corners of the city. Introduced her to a jazz band playing in a speakeasy disguised as a barbershop. Once he showed up outside her apartment at midnight with a blanket just so they could lie under the stars on the hood of his car, talking about everything and nothing. Sophia couldn't help falling for him. She'd never met anyone who made her laugh so easily, who listened so intently, who made life feel less like a grind and more like an adventure. But even in their happiest moments, little red flags fluttered at the edges of her vision. Sometimes Eric went silent for days without explanation. When pressed, he'd joke it off, claiming work stress. Or he'd grow restless, looking out over the city like he was waiting for a door to open so he could run through it. Still, Sophia wanted to believe what they had was real. Then came the night he proposed. It was early December, snow swirling outside a tiny Italian restaurant where candles flickered in mason jars. Eric held Sophia's hand across the table, his thumb brushing her knuckles. "Soph, you make me want to be someone better. Someone stable. I know I'm not perfect. but I can't imagine life without you." Sophia felt tears prick her eyes as he slid a small velvet box across the table. "Will you marry me?" She stared at him breathless, torn between caution and the rush of hope that washed over her like warm light. And for a moment, caution lost. Yes, I'll marry you." Eric let out a shaky laugh, pressing a kiss to her hand. That night, Sophia lay awake, her heart pounding with equal parts joy and fear. Was this too fast? Was she seeing what she wanted to see? But the next day, Eric showed up at her door with a stack of apartment listings and insisted they start planning a life together. Sophia let herself believe. They were married in a small ceremony at City Hall with only a few close friends. Thomas attended, lingering awkwardly at the edge of the photos, hands shoved in his pockets. Sophia thought she saw something haunted in his eyes, but dismissed it as jealousy over losing his best friend to marriage. Weeks turned into months. Sophia worked long hours at the firm, while Eric bounced between real estate clients, sometimes flush with commissions, sometimes scraping to cover bills. Then, one gray afternoon, Sophia found herself standing in her bathroom, staring down at 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test. Her hands trembled as she set it on the sink. Eric found her sitting on the edge of the bathtub, silent. "Hey, you okay?" Sophia met his eyes, voice barely above a whisper. "I'm pregnant." Eric blinked, his jaw flexing. "You're sure?" Sophia nodded, unable to read his expression. After a long silence, Eric pulled her into his arms. "This is huge. I mean, wow. Okay, we'll figure it out. We always do, right?" For a few weeks, it felt like he meant it. Eric went with her to doctor's appointments, holding her hand during ultrasounds. They painted the spare bedroom yellow. Eric even started talking about college funds. At 16 weeks, the ultrasound tech squinted at the screen, then laughed softly. "Looks like you're having twins." Sophia burst into nervous laughter, squeezing Eric's hand. "Twins?" Eric forced a grin. "2 kids, twice the fun, right?" But Sophia could feel the tension rolling off him like waves. He stopped coming home on time, stopped texting as often. Sophia tried to brush it off, blaming hormones for the knot of fear in her stomach. Until the baby shower. It was late June sun streaming through the windows of their apartment, where friends gathered around a table piled high with pastel gift bags. Sophia felt a cramp twist low in her abdomen. She tried to hide it, pressing a hand to her side as she forced a smile. But the pain came again, sharper this time, radiating up her spine. Her glass slipped from her fingers, crashing to the floor. "Whoa, Soph, are you okay?" Jasmine reached for her. Sophia tried to speak, but another wave of pain cut her off. I think something's wrong." Minutes later, she was being rushed through bright hospital corridors under fluorescent lights that seemed too harsh, too bright. Doctors murmured words like preterm labor and complications. Eric paced the waiting room, pale eyes darting toward every passing nurse. Hours blurred into a haze of machines beeping surgical scrubs and cold air. Sophia heard the doctor's voice through the fog. "It's a boy." A baby's thin wail echoed. Relief flooded Sophia's chest. Until the doctor said quietly, "Wait, there's another one." Sophia's eyes flew open. "Another," and then a second cry filled the room. "Another boy." Eric pressed a trembling hand to his mouth. "2, okay, twins, right." But the doctor's brow furrowed. "Oh God, there's one more." Sophia stared at him, dazed. 3. Moments later, the tiniest infant she'd ever seen emerged, her cries barely a whisper. "It's a girl." Eric stood frozen, his face draining of color. Sophia reached for his hand, but he slowly backed away, shaking his head. I can't do this." And deep in her chest, a cold certainty settled in. Because she could see it in his eyes. Eric was already halfway gone. The soft whoosh of ventilators filled the neonatal ICU, blending into the steady beeping of heart monitors. Sophia sat in a stiff plastic chair beside 3 incubators, her eyes red-rimmed, her hospital wristband still digging into her skin. Each baby lay under warm lamps, tiny bodies curled beneath clear plastic domes connected to wires and tubes. Emma, the smallest, barely stirred, except for the faint rise and fall of her chest. Liam and Noah were stronger, their miniature fists flexing as though trying to fight the world already. Sophia brushed a finger gently across the plexiglass, voice trembling. "I'm right here, babies. Mommy's not going anywhere." But deep down, she was terrified. Eric hadn't been back since that night. At first, she'd told herself he just needed air, that he was overwhelmed, same as her, that any minute he'd walk back in with coffee and an apology. But as days turned into a week, hope slowly drained from her veins. No calls, no texts, nothing. She tried his cell, straight to voicemail. She checked hospitals, police stations. No record of him. It was as though Eric Johnson had evaporated into the Chicago skyline. Sophia found herself gripping the rails of the hospital crib, blinking back tears until her vision swam. The nurse came over, laying a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart, you need to rest." Sophia shook her head. "I can't leave them alone." But exhaustion was winning. Her body ached. Her hair hung in limp strands. Late one night, as rain lashed the windows, Sophia pulled her phone from her hoodie pocket and stared at Thomas Cooper's name on the screen. For a moment, her thumb hovered over the call button. He was Eric's friend. He'd be furious at her, or worse. He'd tell her something she didn't want to hear. But finally, she pressed it. "Thomas, it's me," her voice cracked. I can't reach Eric. He's just gone. I don't know what to do." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but tight. "Where are you?" "In the NICU. They're so small, Thomas." "I'm coming." Less than an hour later, Thomas appeared in the hospital doorway, hair wet from the rain, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He took one look at Sophia's face and pulled her into a hug so fierce it nearly broke her. "Hey, I've got you. Okay, you're not alone." Sophia sobbed into his chest, trembling. Thomas spent that first night sitting beside her in the neon-lit hallway outside the NICU. He fetched coffee, dealt with hospital paperwork, and answered doctors' questions when Sophia's brain simply refused to process words. He never once asked her why Eric had left. He just stayed. When the babies were finally well enough to come home, Sophia stared at the stack of paperwork, the medical bills, the giant bag of prescriptions the nurse handed her. She felt like she was drowning. Thomas loaded the car without being asked, buckled 3 impossibly tiny car seats into the back seat of Sophia's old Toyota. He drove them home in silence, glancing at Sophia every few minutes as though checking to make sure she was still breathing. At the apartment, Thomas helped carry in boxes of diapers and formula. He set up 3 bassinets in the living room because Sophia's bedroom was too small for cribs. That first night at home, it was a nightmare. Emma cried. Then Noah started. Then Liam. The cries blended into one piercing wail that seemed to vibrate in Sophia's bones. At 2 a.m., Sophia stood in the kitchen, hands shaking as she tried to measure formula, but her fingers refused to grip the scoop. "I can't do this," she whispered, eyes filling. "I can't." Thomas appeared behind her, gently taking the bottle from her trembling hands. "Yes, you can. You just need help." Sophia stared at him, voice breaking. "They're not even yours, Thomas. Why are you doing this?" Thomas sighed, looking utterly exhausted but somehow steady. "Because you're mine, and they're part of you. That's enough." Sophia blinked, trying to swallow the lump in her throat. Thomas placed a hand on her back, warm and reassuring. "Go sit down. I'll handle this feeding." She wanted to protest, but her legs felt like rubber. Sophia sank onto the couch, listening as Thomas moved around the kitchen, mixing formula and humming quietly under his breath. In the weeks that followed, Thomas kept showing up. He washed dishes piled in the sink, changed diapers at 3 a.m. when Sophia was too tired to open her eyes, held Emma against his chest for hours when her tiny body refused to settle. He even started leaving his own apartment, less and less practically living on Sophia's couch. The whispers started. Neighbors wondered why Thomas was always there. Friends dropped not-so-subtle hints about moving on, but Sophia didn't have the energy to care. One morning, Sophia woke to find Thomas asleep on the floor beside the bassinets, one arm draped over a crying Noah, gently rocking the little bed. Sophia stood in the doorway, a mug of cold coffee in her hand, staring at him. And despite everything, the emptiness left behind by Eric, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. She didn't know what it meant. She didn't know if she'd ever trust her heart again. But she knew one thing for certain. Thomas Cooper was the only reason she hadn't fallen apart completely. And deep down, a tiny part of her wondered if maybe, just maybe, she was starting to feel something she thought she'd lost forever. 12 years later, spring sunlight spilled over Chicago, catching on glass towers and sparkling off Lake Michigan like scattered diamonds. Sophia Bennett sat in her office at Golden Knox Law Group, her dark hair pulled into a sleek bun, a navy suit fitting her like a custom glove. The space around her smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paper, a quiet oasis above the city's noise. On her desk sat photos, Liam and Noah in soccer uniforms, Emma holding a violin, and Thomas standing beside them, smiling. Her phone buzzed with new client messages. Her inbox flashed with legal filings waiting for review, but Sophia barely noticed any of it, because when she glanced up, Eric Johnson stood in the doorway. He looked older, thinner. His once confident grin was gone, replaced by an uncertain half-smile. A rumpled jacket hung on narrow shoulders, and deep lines cut across his forehead. Sophia felt her chest tighten. Eric swallowed, his voice softer than she remembered. "Hey, Soph." Sophia pushed back her chair, slowly measuring each word. "What the hell are you doing here, Eric?" Eric shuffled inside, glancing at the floor. I know I've got no right, but I needed to see you. Things have gone bad for me." Sophia crossed her arms. "Define bad." Eric let out a shaky breath. "I lost my job 3 months ago. Fell behind on rent, credit cards. Everything's a mess. I'm staying on a friend's couch. I'm drowning, Soph." Sophia's expression stayed like granite. "And you think that's my problem?" Eric winced. "I'm not saying it's your problem. I need help. A loan. Something to get back on my feet." Sophia barked a short laugh. "You left me in a hospital with 3 premature babies, Eric, and vanished. You think I owe you now?" Eric's eyes glistened. "I know I screwed up. I know I don't deserve anything. But I'm desperate. I thought maybe you'd understand." Sophia shook her head slowly. "I don't understand anything about you anymore." Eric hesitated. His gaze dropped to the family photos on her desk. His eyes narrowed. "Thomas is still around, huh?" Sophia stiffened. "What's that supposed to mean?" Eric let out a humorless chuckle. "Funny how he stepped right in the second I left. You know, I've had a lot of time to think. And I started remembering things, like the bet he and I made the night I met you." Sophia felt her stomach drop. "Don't." But Eric leaned closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "We both know Thomas was in on it. $2,000 that I could get you to go out with me. He was part of it, Soph, and if you don't help me, I'll make sure everyone knows." Sophia swallowed, trying to steady her voice. "That was 12 years ago. Ancient history. No one cares." Eric's smile turned sharp. "Your kids will care. You think Liam and Noah want to hear their mother was a bar bet. You think Emma wants to hear that Thomas, their hero, lied to you from day one." Sophia stared at him, rage and heartbreak swirling in her chest. "Get out." Eric didn't move. $50,000, Soph. That's all I'm asking, and I walk away. No interviews, no scandals. No explaining to your kids how your perfect life started as a joke." Sophia's voice dropped to a cold whisper. "I am not giving you a single penny." Eric tilted his head. "You sure about that? I've still got friends in the press. And Thomas isn't squeaky clean either. You know how fast stories spread in this city." Sophia drew a sharp breath, fighting to keep her voice even. "You ruined your own life, Eric. Don't come crawling back to destroy mine." Eric's shoulders tensed. "Don't make me do this, Soph. I'm not the villain you think I am. I need help." Sophia's eyes filled, her voice trembling but firm. "You are the villain, Eric. You were the day you walked away from those babies in that hospital. You still are now." Eric hesitated, his eyes darting to the floor, then back to her face. "Think about it. You've got until Friday." He turned and left the door shutting with a soft click behind him. Sophia stood frozen, staring at the empty space where he'd been. She sank into her chair, pressing trembling fingers to her temples. Then, with a shuddering breath, she picked up her phone and called Thomas. "Hey, Soph, everything okay?" His voice was warm, familiar. But Sophia's voice broke as she whispered, "Eric's back. He wants $50,000, or he's telling the kids everything." On the other end of the line, Thomas fell silent. Finally, he murmured, voice hoarse, "Then we tell them first." Sophia closed her eyes, fighting tears. "I don't know if I can." Thomas paused. "Then let me help you, like I always have." Sophia stared at the family photo on her desk, her children's smiles frozen in time. Because once again, everything she'd built was teetering on the edge. And she wasn't sure how much more she could lose. The rain fell in fine gray sheets outside Sophia's office window, streaking the glass and washing the city in silver. Inside, files lay scattered across her desk, lit by the glow of her desk lamp. Legal documents, bank records, old text messages, printed and highlighted in yellow. Sophia sat with her elbows on the desk, her fingers pressed to her temples. She felt like a woman perched on the edge of a cliff, the wind howling around her, threatening to send everything crashing into the rocks below. Eric's threat echoed in her head. $50,000, or her entire life unraveled. And worse, the truth about Thomas. She tried to steady her breath as Thomas entered the office, closing the door gently behind him. He looked older, lines deeper around his eyes, his hair dusted with gray. but there was a quiet strength in him, the same steady presence that had carried her through every storm. Thomas approached cautiously. "Soph, you wanted to talk." Sophia didn't look up. "I'm not giving Eric a cent." Thomas exhaled slowly, sinking into the chair across from her. "I agree." Sophia lifted her gaze, her voice edged with pain. "But if he goes public, if he tells the kids, what happens to us, Thomas?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "We tell them first, together, no more secrets." Sophia stared at him, searching his face. "And if they hate us for it," Thomas swallowed, voice raw, "then we deal with that. Because the only thing worse than the truth is living a lie." Sophia clenched her fists, a tear slipping free. "I can't believe he's still doing this, after 12 years. Thomas looked down at his hands. "He's drowning Soph, and drowning people. They'll pull anyone under to save themselves." Sophia brushed away the tear, her voice hardening. "I'm pressing charges." Thomas blinked. "For blackmail. For blackmail, for attempted extortion, for everything he's put us through." Thomas hesitated. "You sure that's going to drag a lot into the open?" Sophia set her jaw. "I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of pretending, and I'm done letting Eric decide how my story ends." She picked up the folder on her desk and slammed it shut. "I'm going to the state's attorney tomorrow." Thomas reached across the desk, gently covering her hand with his. "I'll go with you." Sophia blinked back, fresh tears. "You might hate me for this, but a part of me still wishes he'd just stayed gone." Thomas squeezed her hand. "I wish that too." The next morning they sat in a small, sterile conference room at the Cook County State's Attorney's office. An assistant state's attorney, a young woman with bright red hair and a fierce expression, listened carefully as Sophia explained everything: Eric's threats, the money demand, the potential media leak. Sophia laid out bank records showing Eric's financial spiral, the text messages demanding cash, the veiled threats about going to the press. The attorney nodded grimly. "We can work with this. It's a clear case of attempted extortion, and given his history of abandoning the children, it paints a pretty damning picture." Sophia stared at her hands clasped in her lap. "Will it go public?" The attorney softened her voice. "Eventually, it might hit the press, but it's better coming from you than from him." Sophia took a slow breath. "Then do it." 3 days later, Eric was arrested at a gas station on the west side. His hood pulled low, hands shoved deep in his pockets. The news hit local channels within hours. "Man arrested in attempted blackmail of Chicago attorney." Sophia tried not to watch the coverage, but she couldn't help herself. The camera showed Eric being led into the station in handcuffs, his eyes darting away from the lights. She felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, only exhaustion. At the arraignment, Sophia sat in the courtroom, Thomas beside her, holding her hand so tight her fingers ached. Eric shuffled in wearing an orange jumpsuit. He glanced at Sophia, his face pale, his voice trembling. "Your Honor, I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I'm broke. I thought, maybe I could make things right if I just had some money." Sophia felt her jaw tighten. "Right, by destroying my children's lives." Eric's voice broke. "I thought, if I could just get back on my feet, I could be part of their lives again. I miss them, Soph. I miss all of it." Sophia blinked, her voice low and even. "You don't get to miss them, Eric. You left." Eric closed his eyes, a tear slipping free. Thomas spoke then, his voice steady but edged with steel. "We spent 12 years cleaning up the mess you left. Don't you dare pretend this was about love. This was about money and fear." The judge looked down at Eric, eyes cold. "Mr. Johnson, you attempted to extort a woman you abandoned, and you threatened to expose private information purely for financial gain. This court finds you guilty of attempted extortion and sentences you to 7 years in state prison." Eric stared down at his shackled hands, his shoulders shaking. Sophia sat motionless, breathing slowly, willing herself not to cry. When court adjourned, Thomas pulled her into a hug. Sophia buried her face in his shoulder, whispering, "Does it ever really end?" Thomas pressed his lips to her hair. "No, but we keep going anyway." As they stepped out into the cool afternoon, cameras flashed. Questions flew from reporters. Sophia lifted her chin and kept walking, Thomas's hand clasped firmly in hers. Because for the first time in 12 years, the past wasn't holding the reins anymore. Spring pushed its way back into Chicago, melting the last stubborn patches of snow clinging to sidewalks and turning the trees in Grant Park into soft clouds of green. Sophia stood at the window of her high-rise apartment, looking out over the shimmering lake. Her reflection in the glass seemed older, somehow wiser, the sharp angles of her face softened by years of resilience. Behind her, the apartment hummed with life. Thomas was in the kitchen humming off-key as he tried to flip pancakes without burning them. Liam and Noah were arguing over whose science project was cooler. Emma sat cross-legged at the coffee table, carefully painting a clay sculpture for art class. Sophia smiled faintly as she watched them. It wasn't the life she'd imagined 12 years ago. It wasn't the fairy tale she thought she'd signed up for. But it was hers. She turned from the window just as Thomas appeared with a plate piled high with pancakes, his hair sticking up in wild tufts. Okay, fair warning. Some of these are a little crispy. Sophia arched an eyebrow. Is that what we're calling burned now? Thomas grinned. I'm rebranding. Crispy sounds gourmet. Sophia laughed a real laugh, not the polite chuckle she'd faked so many times in the past. The kids groaned as Thomas set the plate on the table. Dad? Seriously, Liam said, poking a pancake with his fork. It's basically charcoal. Hey, I worked hard on these, Thomas protested, throwing his hands up. Love is a secret ingredient, all right? Sophia slipped an arm around his waist. Well, it's the thought that counts. Thomas leaned down and pressed a kiss to her temple. Emma piped up, voice hesitant. Mom, are you okay now about everything? Sophia turned to look at her daughter's wide brown eyes. She thought about how close she'd come to losing herself in old wounds, about the courtroom, the secrets dragged into the light, the years spent wondering if Eric would come back, and somehow, the weight didn't feel as crushing as it once had. Sophia knelt beside Emma, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Sweetheart. Sometimes life throws things at you that you never see coming. People hurt you. They leave, or they come back when you least expect it. And it makes you feel like the ground's gone out from under your feet. Emma blinked at her, listening intently. But the thing is, you're stronger than you think. You keep standing up, you keep going. And eventually, you realize the storm didn't break you. It just made you braver. Emma leaned forward, hugging her tightly. I'm glad you're my mom. Sophia's eyes stung as she hugged her back. I'm glad you're my girl. The doorbell rang, jolting them all. Thomas frowned, expecting anyone. Sophia shook her head. Thomas opened the door to find a postal worker holding a small envelope. For Sophia Bennett. Sophia took it heart-thudding. The return address was from the Illinois Department of Corrections. Eric. She carried it to the kitchen table, hands trembling slightly as she opened it. Inside was a simple letter written in shaky script. Sophia, I know I don't deserve you reading this, but I've had a lot of time to think. I've blamed everyone else for the mess I made. The truth is, I was scared. Scared of being a husband, scared of being a father. And when the babies came early, it felt like I was drowning. I ran because I thought you'd be better off without me. But I see now, I was wrong. I'm sorry for all of it. For the bet, for leaving, for coming back just to try to fix my problems with money. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know that you didn't deserve any of this. You deserved the world. I hope someday your kids know how strong their mother really is. Eric. Sophia sat there staring at the paper, her eyes blurring with tears. Thomas watched her quietly. You okay? Sophia folded the letter and set it aside. I think I'm finally going to be. Thomas touched her hand gently. You don't have to keep carrying him around anymore. He made his choices, you made yours, and you built something good. Sophia exhaled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. You know, I used to think forgiving someone meant letting them back in. But now I know. It just means I'm done letting him have power over me. Thomas nodded. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen. Sophia stood glancing around at her children, at Thomas, at the sun shining through the kitchen windows. She cleared her throat. I've learned a lot these past 12 years. That love isn't perfect. That people fail us. Sometimes even the ones we trust most. But I've also learned that your past doesn't have to dictate your future. And that sometimes the family you choose is even stronger than the one you were born into. She looked at Emma, Liam, and Noah, her voice firm but soft. And if there's one thing I want you all to remember, it's that no matter how dark things look, you always have the power to write the next chapter of your story. Thomas squeezed her hand, especially if it involves less crispy pancakes. Sophia laughed, wiping her eyes. Deal. As the family gathered around the table, voices overlapping forks, clinking against plates, the sound of laughter slowly drowned out the echoes of old ghosts. Outside, the city carried on buzzing with cars and footsteps and possibility. Sophia gazed out the window, the sun catching the glass towers in blazing streaks of gold. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt free.